stop trying to make him miss you by simply vanishing. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but here's what nobody actually tells you about how men think. The idea sounds almost paradoxical at first. The more someone tries to engineer their absence into meaning, the more they try to become a memory, a question mark, a lingering presence in someone else's mind, the more they accidentally reveal something else entirely, not impact, not significance, but emotional unsafety, unpredictability, and disconnection. Psychology has a name for part of this dynamic. It is often linked to what is called reactance, the human tendency to resist pressure when we feel something is being controlled or performed for us. When someone senses that attention, distance, or silence is being used strategically, the mind does not register it as mystery or depth. It registers it as emotional manipulation or instability. And the nervous system, which is far more sensitive than the storytelling mind, does not lean in. It pulls back. So when someone tries too hard to be missed, they often end up activating the opposite response. Instead of attachment forming, uncertainty increases. Instead of longing, emotional withdrawal begins. Instead of curiosity deepening, clarity quietly emerges in the other person's perception that something does not feel grounded. Because real emotional impact is not created through absence that is performed, it is created through presence that is felt. Human memory does not cling strongly to inconsistency unless it is tied to emotional safety or meaningful depth. Instead, the brain organizes emotional recall through patterns. This is where concepts like reinforcement and predictability quietly shape attraction far more than dramatic gestures ever do. When someone is warm one moment and distant the next, engaging and then disappearing, expressive and then unavailable, the mind struggles to build a stable emotional model of them, and what the brain cannot map clearly, it eventually stops prioritizing. This is where many people misunderstand the nature of being missed. They assume absence alone creates emotional weight. But absence only creates weight when it interrupts something stable, something meaningful, something that already has emotional structure built around it. In other words, you are missed when your presence has already become psychologically reliable, not when your disappearance is strategically inconsistent. There is also something deeper happening beneath the surface, something tied to how the nervous system encodes safety. Emotional attachment is not built on intensity alone. It is built on repetition, predictability, and emotional attunement. When someone feels understood in your presence, when interactions feel consistent rather than confusing, when emotional tone is steady rather than volatile, the brain begins to associate you with regulation, with calm, with safety. And safety is what creates lasting emotional imprinting. When that foundation is missing, when connection feels like guessing instead of knowing, the brain shifts into a different mode. It begins scanning for certainty rather than bonding through closeness. This is why inconsistent behavior often produces anxiety rather than longing. The emotional system cannot relax enough to form stable attachment, so instead of deepening connection, it begins protecting itself from it. Now contrast that with what happens when someone tries to be missed through emotional distance, silence, or withdrawal tactics. Instead of creating attachment, they introduce unpredictability into the system. The other person no longer experiences them as emotionally reliable. Instead, they become harder to read, harder to feel secure with, and eventually harder to emotionally invest in. At first, this might create temporary curiosity. The mind naturally tries to resolve gaps in understanding. But curiosity is not the same as attachment. Curiosity fades once the pattern resolves, or once the emotional cost of decoding becomes too high. And if what follows that curiosity is more inconsistency, the emotional system does something very simple. It deprioritizes the source of confusion. This is where the illusion breaks. Because many people confuse being thought about with being emotionally significant. But thought is not the same as attachment. Someone can cross the mind and still lose emotional relevance. And someone else can feel absent, yet remain deeply embedded in emotional memory because their presence created coherence rather than confusion. There is also a quieter psychological truth here. People do not miss emotional effort that feels performative. They miss emotional experiences that felt real, reciprocal, and grounding. The mind does not form lasting attachment to someone who feels like they are managing perception rather than sharing connection. Because beneath all conscious interpretation, humans are constantly evaluating one thing in relationships: emotional authenticity. And authenticity cannot be faked through absence. This is why the harder someone tries to engineer their own absence into emotional value, the more fragile the outcome becomes. It turns connection into strategy instead of experience. It shifts the focus from "how do I relate" to "how do I appear in their mind?" And that shift alone is enough to weaken emotional resonance, because connection stops being about mutual presence and becomes about controlled visibility. Ironically, the people who are most deeply remembered are rarely the ones who tried to be missed. They are the ones who were fully present when they were there. They were consistent enough to feel safe, real enough to feel human, and emotionally aligned enough to create clarity instead of confusion. And when they leave, whether temporarily or permanently, they leave behind something the nervous system actually recognizes as loss. Not uncertainty, not emotional chaos, but the absence of something that once felt stable. That is what creates real missing. Not distance, not silence, not strategic withdrawal, but contrast. The contrast between presence that felt meaningful and the absence of that presence. And this is where the most important realization begins to surface. You cannot manipulate your way into being valued. You cannot perform absence into significance. You cannot confuse unpredictability with depth and expect it to create emotional attachment that lasts. The human nervous system is far too sensitive to inconsistency for that illusion to hold for long. What actually creates emotional impact is far simpler, even if it is harder to embody. It is being real when you are there, being consistent enough that others feel safe with your presence, being emotionally coherent enough that your absence means something when it happens naturally, not strategically. Because in the end, people do not miss the version of you that was trying to be missed. They miss the version of you that felt real enough to remember without effort. Right now, you're probably doing one of three things. Either you're giving him everything he wants the second he wants it, or you're playing hard to get and hoping that will make him chase you, or you're stuck somewhere in between, trying to be the perfect version of yourself and wondering why he still seems to be pulling away. All three of these approaches share the same flaw. They're all built around him instead of around you. But what if I told you that the women men can't stop thinking about, the ones they chase for months or even years after it's over, aren't playing any games at all? They're operating from a completely different mindset. And by the time this is over, you'll understand exactly what that mindset is and how to use it yourself. Here's the truth that changes everything. Men don't miss women who try to make themselves missed. They miss women who create emotional addiction. And that's a massive difference, one that will change how you approach every single interaction with him going forward. Most advice out there tells you to pull back, stay mysterious, never text first. Honestly, that's beginner level stuff. Those are just tactics. What I'm about to teach you is something closer to psychological strategy, the elegant kind, where he never even realizes what's happening to him. All he knows is that he needs more of you. So if you're exhausted from wondering whether he's thinking about you, if you're done picking apart his texts looking for hidden meaning, and if you actually want to know what it feels like to have a man crave your presence for real, then pay close attention, because I'm about to show you how to rewire his brain to connect you with feelings he simply can't find anywhere else. Let's start with the biggest myth you've probably been fed about making a man miss you. Ready? The myth is that distance automatically makes someone fonder. That's just not how the male brain actually works. Distance without any emotional weight behind it just breeds indifference. But distance that follows real emotional impact, that's what creates obsession. Think of your favorite song. You don't miss silence, you miss that particular melody, those specific lyrics, the exact way it makes you feel. That's emotional imprinting, and it's the real secret behind making a man miss you so deeply he can't think about anything else. Here's what actually happens inside his head when you disappear without ever creating that emotional imprint in the first place. Nothing. Literally nothing. His mind has no reason to search for you because you never gave it anything significant to search for. You just fade into background noise and he barely registers that it's gone quiet. But once you understand how to create what I call emotional withdrawal, something completely different happens. His brain starts actively chasing the feelings you gave him, not necessarily you as a person, but the way being around you made him feel. And when he can't recreate that feeling anywhere else, that's when the real missing kicks in. The most magnetic women I know operate exactly like this. They're fully present when they're present, and genuinely absent when they're absent. There's no desperation in it, no overanalyzing, no second-guessing whether they're doing the right thing. They just move according to their own rhythm and let the men in their lives adjust to it rather than the other way around. This creates what I call the emotional roller coaster effect. Not the toxic hot and cold kind, but the intriguing kind, where he never quite knows which version of you he's going to get next and finds himself fascinated by all of them. Now let's talk about how to actually build identity memory with any man starting tonight. The key is learning to reflect back to him the parts of his personality that he's proud of but rarely gets to express. Every man is carrying around hidden traits he values but almost never shows anyone. Maybe he's genuinely funny but stuck in a serious, buttoned-up job. Maybe he's creative but spends most of his life being practical out of necessity. Maybe he's adventurous underneath a pretty routine lifestyle. Maybe he's sharp and thoughtful, but surrounded by people who never really notice it. Your role is to become the woman who actually sees and appreciates those hidden sides of him, not in some obvious over-the-top way, but subtly. When he cracks a joke, don't just laugh at it. Tell him his sense of humor is genuinely unique. When he shares an idea, don't just nod along. Tell him he has an interesting way of thinking. When he takes even a small risk, acknowledge that adventurous streak in him. Here's the key most women miss. Most compliments men receive are about the obvious stuff, their looks, their job, their possessions. But the compliments that actually build identity memory are the ones that recognize character traits, quirks, and ways of being that he personally values, but almost never hears acknowledged out loud. When you consistently do this, something powerful happens in his mind. You become linked to his favorite version of himself. And men become genuinely addicted to the people who make them feel like their best selves. But here's the part almost every woman misses. Once you've created that identity memory, once you've shown him that version of himself, you have to give him space to actually miss it. You can't be available around the clock handing him that feeling on demand. That's exactly where emotional withdrawal comes in. This is where strategic absence becomes powerful, not random absence, not manipulative game playing, but intentional space that lets the emotional imprint you've already created keep echoing in his mind. Let's talk about the art of strategic presence and absence. This has nothing to do with disappearing at random or playing hard to get. It's about understanding emotional rhythm and using it to create a pull that's almost impossible to resist. I call this the peak and valley method. You create emotional peaks through meaningful connection and then valleys through intentional distance. It's the contrast between the two that generates the craving. During the peak moments, you're fully present, fully engaged, showing that hidden side of yourself, reflecting his best qualities back to him, building real emotional depth. These moments don't need to be long. Sometimes the most powerful peaks are short but intense bursts of genuine connection. Then instead of trying to sustain that same intensity constantly, you allow a valley to form. You become a little less available, not in a cold way, but in a mysterious one. You've got your own life going on. You're not always instantly responsive. You're simply living, and he gets to be part of that sometimes, not all the time. This valley period matters because it's when his brain actually processes what just happened during the peak. It's when that emotional memory settles in and solidifies. It's when he starts craving the next peak moment with you. A lot of women are afraid of these valleys because they assume it means losing the connection. But valleys are actually what give the peaks their meaning. Without contrast, there's no real intensity. Without space, there's no genuine longing. Here's how you'd actually apply this in real life. Say you have an incredible conversation with him one evening. Real connection, laughter, depth. That's your peak. Instead of rushing to recreate that exact energy immediately through more texts or calls, you give it room to breathe. You become slightly less available for the next day or two. You let him sit with that positive experience instead of watering it down with more contact right away. During that valley period, you're not ice cold or ignoring him, but you're not chasing him either. You stay warm if he reaches out, but you're focused on your own life and you're quietly building some mystery around what you're up to and who you're spending time with. What happens during this window is genuinely interesting. His mind starts replaying that peak moment on its own. He starts wondering when the next one will happen. He starts thinking about what you're doing. The emotional memory of how good he felt around you starts to intensify precisely because it isn't being diluted by constant contact. Now let's get into specific tactics for creating emotional withdrawal in different situations, starting with texting, since this is where most women unknowingly sabotage themselves. The biggest mistake is treating texting like ordinary conversation instead of treating it like emotional currency. Every message should either build anticipation, spark curiosity, or reinforce that identity memory you've built. Texting just to fill silence or to maintain constant contact actually works against you. Here's a strategy worth trying. Instead of asking something generic like, "How was your day?" try something like, "I had a thought about something you said yesterday, and it's been stuck in my head." Then don't explain further right away. Let him ask what you meant. This builds curiosity and shows him he's taking up mental space in your world, even while you're apart. Another option is what I'd call the callback text, referencing something specific from an earlier conversation that showed off a positive side of his personality. Something like, "I saw something today that reminded me of that story about your trip. Your adventurous streak is honestly really attractive." This reinforces identity memory while also giving him a small dopamine hit. But here's the crucial part with texting. Don't make yourself constantly available to respond. Don't mirror his response times. Don't feel obligated to keep every conversation alive. Sometimes send something intriguing and then go quiet for a few hours. Let him wonder what you're up to. This isn't about being rude or manipulative. It's about actually having a life outside your phone. It's about valuing your own time and energy and understanding that being instantly available all the time actually lowers how valuable you seem in his mind. Now let's address something important. What if you've already been too available? What if you've been the one always texting first, always responding instantly, always going out of your way to accommodate him? Can you turn that around? Absolutely. But it takes a deliberate shift that might feel uncomfortable at first. The key here is what I call a pattern interrupt. You have to break the predictable rhythm you've established and spark curiosity about the sudden change. Here's how to pull that off without being dramatic or obvious. Start by gradually reducing your availability. Don't go from texting non-stop to complete radio silence. That's too jarring and will likely backfire. Instead, slowly become a little less responsive over time. If you usually reply within 5 minutes, stretch that to 30. If you always text good morning first, skip it every now and then. If you're always free whenever he wants to hang out, start occasionally having other plans. The goal is to create subtle confusion in his mind. He should sense that something feels different without being able to pinpoint exactly what changed. That confusion generates mental engagement, and mental engagement is the very first step toward genuine craving. Here's the psychology behind why this actually works. When someone is always available, the brain files them away as a resource that isn't going anywhere. There's no urgency, no fear of losing them, no reason to prioritize them at all. But once that availability becomes uncertain, the brain reclassifies that person as something that could actually be lost, and that shift is what triggers pursuit. Just be careful during this transition though. Don't turn cold or distant, and don't punish him for how available you used to be. Just become more selective about when and how you engage. Show him, without saying it outright, that your time and energy are valuable resources he has to actually earn. Now let's talk about the post-breakup situation, because this is where the principles of emotional withdrawal show up at their most powerful. If you've recently ended things with someone and you want him to genuinely miss you, the first thing to understand is that your instincts right now are probably wrong. Your gut is telling you to reach out, to explain yourself, to fix things, to remind him of what he's losing. All of those instincts work against you. They kill the mystery, lower your perceived value, and completely derail the emotional withdrawal process before it can even start. Instead, you need to disappear fully for a meaningful stretch of time, not just off his phone, but out of his overall awareness. No engaging with his social media, no showing up in places he might be, no reaching him through mutual friends. You essentially need to become a ghost. But here's what separates this from typical no-contact advice. While you're absent from his world, you're not just sitting around passively waiting for him to come back. You're actively building a better life in ways that would genuinely surprise him if he knew. The psychological impact of this is powerful in the best possible way. While he's expecting you to chase him, to fall apart, to need him, you're becoming someone who clearly doesn't need anyone. That contrast creates a kind of mental tension that drives obsessive thinking. Let's go over the mistakes that kill emotional withdrawal and make you forgettable instead of unforgettable. The biggest one is breaking your own silence too soon. You create the space, you sense him starting to miss you, you feel the pull working, and then you reach out because you miss him too, or because you're scared you're losing him. Doing this completely unravels everything you've built. It reveals that your distance wasn't really about having a full life, it was a strategy all along. And the moment he realizes it was a strategy, he stops responding to it. Real emotional withdrawal only works when it's authentic, when your life is genuinely full enough that you don't need constant contact with him, when the space you create is a natural byproduct of your priorities rather than a calculated move for attention. The second major mistake is being inconsistent with your energy whenever you do interact. If you've created distance and he reaches out, don't be cold or punishing toward him. Stay warm, but keep it brief. Be pleasant without being overly eager. Let him know you're glad to hear from him without seeming desperate for his attention. Another critical mistake is neglecting your own growth during those absence periods. If you're creating space but spending that time obsessing over him, checking his social media constantly, overanalyzing his behavior, you're still emotionally tethered to him, even if you're not showing it outwardly. You're still operating from that needy, anxious frequency internally, even while appearing distant on the surface. The most magnetic women use that alone time to actually become more interesting, more confident, and more fulfilled. They dive into hobbies, nurture friendships, invest in their careers, take care of their health, and explore new passions. So when they do eventually reconnect, they're genuinely more attractive because they've actually grown in the meantime. Now let's talk about the mindset that makes all of this feel effortless instead of exhausting. The women who naturally inspire this kind of longing in men aren't sitting around trying to inspire it. They're focused on living well. They're focused on honoring their own needs. They're focused on building a life so fulfilling that any man who wants a place in it has to bring real value to the table. This mental shift changes everything. Instead of asking, "How do I make him miss me?" you start asking, "How do I build a life so amazing that anyone would miss being part of it?" Instead of obsessing over his behavior, you redirect that energy toward your own growth. When you operate from this mindset, emotional withdrawal stops being a tactic and becomes completely natural. You're not available all the time simply because you have real things going on. You're not texting constantly because you have other sources of fulfillment in your life. You're not chasing anyone because you're not coming from a place of lack. This kind of authentic self-focus creates the most powerful form of attraction there is because it isn't needy or manipulative in any way. It's simply magnetic. Men are drawn to women who are genuinely content in their own lives because that kind of contentment is rare and rarity is attractive. So let's put together your action plan for becoming the woman he genuinely can't forget. This isn't about blindly following a rule book. It's about understanding these principles and adapting them to your own life. Step 1 is an immediate pattern disruption. If you've been overly available starting today, cut your response time in half. If you normally reply within 5 minutes, stretch it to 10. If you usually respond the instant a message comes in, wait an hour instead. This small shift creates immediate curiosity without being dramatic about it. Step 2 is doing an energy audit. Look back at the last week of your interactions with him. How much of your emotional energy went toward him versus toward your own life and your own goals? Ideally, that ratio should be no more than 30% toward him and 70% toward yourself. If it's leaning the other way, that's a sign you have some rebalancing to do. Step 3 is intentionally creating peak experiences. The next time you're with him, focus fully on building emotional depth. Ask questions that draw out his personality. Share something real and honest about yourself. Make him genuinely laugh. Create a moment that stands apart from your usual everyday interactions. Step 4 is strategic absence. After you've created that peak moment, pull back your availability for roughly 48 to 72 hours. Don't be the one to reach out first. Stay focused on your own life. Let him sit with that positive experience instead of diluting it with more contact right away. Step 5 is staying consistent. This isn't a one-time trick. It's a whole new way of operating. Keep the peak and valley rhythm going. Keep prioritizing your own life. Keep being intentional about when and how you choose to engage. Now, what if he doesn't respond the way you're hoping he will? This part matters. Not every man will respond to emotional withdrawal, and honestly, that tells you something valuable. If someone doesn't miss you when you're not constantly available, it usually means the connection wasn't as deep as you thought it was. Don't take that personally. Some people just aren't compatible with you on that level. Some men genuinely prefer women who are always available because it's simpler and demands less effort from them. Those aren't the men worth your time anyway. The right man for you will respond to your increased self-respect and selectivity by stepping up his own effort. He'll become more intentional about making time for you. He'll be more present when you're actually together. He'll start valuing access to you because he'll realize it isn't something he's automatically entitled. Remember, the goal here was never to manipulate someone into wanting you. The real goal is to present the most genuine, attractive version of yourself, which is simply a woman who values herself enough to hold real boundaries and standards. So yes, I've given you concrete strategies for building emotional withdrawal and making a man genuinely miss you. But the real transformation happens when you use these same strategies to reconnect with your own power and your own worth, when you remember that you were never trying to convince anyone to want you. You're simply being selective about who earns access to the incredible woman you already are.